Hello there. Didn't see you come in. Please. I'm glad you're here because there's an important issue that I wanted to talk to you about. You know, with all of the violent and armed conflict in the world today, the idea of successful peace building is very important to look at in some detail. After all, the fighting and violence is bound to end sometime, and when it does and the smoke clears and all is said and done, the discussion then turns to peace-building solutions, to conflicts that began with anything but peace. It's not always an easy process. When people come out of violence, they often jump to the quickest, easiest solutions, regardless of the things that might get overlooked in the process. Unfortunately, these kinds of solutions frequently end up ignoring a group of people that are critical to these processes from the outset. Who are they, you might ask? Chances are, if you're not one of them yourself, then you know one. That's right, I'm talking about women. Oftentimes, the kinds of societies that have armed conflicts are also the kinds of societies that operate largely on patriarchal structures and assumptions. The parties that are invited to the negotiating table post-conflict are usually dominated by men, and many of these men find it difficult to see the importance of allowing women to take active roles in the discussions. Obviously, this assumption is mistaken. In fact, recent studies have shown that women play a vital role in peace-building dialogues. The idea that women don't have a stake in the discussions and agreements made, or that they somehow never had a role in the conflict in the first place, is entirely mistaken. In fact, the reality is quite the opposite. Why don't you and I take a closer look at how women worldwide play an important role in peace-building in post-conflict societies? We'll look at two case studies in particular to emphasize this importance. I hope that at the end of this journey, you'll come away with a better understanding of how women can facilitate these discussions and why it is so important that we allow them to do so. On October 31st, 2000, the United Nations unanimously passed Resolution 1325. For the first time, the vital role that women play in peace-building negotiations was formally recognized. This resolution also paved the way for women to take on more active roles from within their governments so that they could begin to effect changes that they saw as important. You know, if you're like me, you probably wonder if this resolution has really worked out, or if it's just been yet another fanciful idea for member nations to trample all over anyway. It's a reasonable question to ask. Unfortunately, there are still so many places with cultures that simply consider women to be second-rate human beings. The answer, though, is twofold. On the one hand, Resolution 1325 has, to some extent, allowed for women's issues to make it to the negotiating table in peace talks. But what's interesting is that the women themselves are frequently absent from the peace talks entirely. They're left, then, to trust that their male counterparts will follow through and address the issues that are important to them. I think that's a problem. If women are really to take on these active roles posited by Resolution 1325, they need to be there, right in the middle of the fray, fighting to make sure their voices get heard. One of the most revealing cases to look at in terms of women taking an active role in peace building is the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. After 30 years of violent armed conflict between Protestants and Catholics, a ceasefire was established in the 1990s, and the focus then shifted to reaching a peace agreement. Initially, Northern Irish women didn't have a place in these talks, but it wasn't long before they formed their own micro-party, known as the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. Through this group, women were able to come to the table and actively take part in the discussions. As you might have guessed, it wasn't a walk in the park for these women, even after they made it to the table. Men from various other parties displayed a great deal of sexism, wondering out loud why these women were even allowed to take part in the peace talks at all. After all, they believed that women really had no say. The conflict was between Catholics and Protestants. But the NIWC wouldn't take this treatment lying down. In the end, they fought to make sure that their concerns were addressed, and they even helped to bring the discussion back together after it almost completely broke down at one point. When the Belfast Agreement of 1998 was finally reached, U.S. Senator George Mitchell was one of the first to acknowledge the critical role that the women of the NIWC had played. If it hadn't been for these women, he said, several important issues may never have even been mentioned, including victims' rights, education, housing, and young people. The Belfast Agreement, or the Good Friday Agreement as it is often called, happened 2 years before the UN passed Resolution 1325, but it stands as an important reference point for the role women play in peacebuilding. Now we turn to Iraq, and the conditions that women face there today. Unfortunately, this story isn't as hopeful. Women in Iraq continue to face violence among other issues. I think it's safe to say that the Muslim culture hasn't always seen women as equal beings to men. No wonder then that their issues haven't been as heavily emphasized as in other places. Today, women report that while they have been granted the space to pursue legal action in cases of violence, they often face uphill battles with judges and juries that are still dominated by patriarchy. Judges, who are almost always men, often display an attitude that sees the women not as victims, but as harlots, only looking to raise a fuss. Of course, the case of Iraq must be approached cautiously. To assume that their culture is in any way similar to that of Northern Ireland's is inaccurate at best and probably dangerous at worst. But in general, I think that it is safe to say that if women had been granted as active a role that women in Northern Ireland had in the 1990s, greater attention would be paid to their issues. The political climate in Iraq is still quite shaky, and the patriarchal structures that have dominated for so long are far from toppling. It would be interesting to see how differently these women would fare had they been allowed to actively take part in the peacebuilding discussions that took place after the removal of Saddam Hussein. Only time will tell if they will ever have a fighting chance to be seen as equals in the eyes of Iraqi men, but as things look right now, the possibilities seem slim. Of course, Northern Ireland and Iraq are only two cases among many on the topic of women and peacebuilding around the world. There are many others we could look at, but we'll have to wait for another time. As you can see, it's very important that women have a place at the table in peace talks. Not only do they bring a unique perspective, but they also bring a greater attention to social issues that might get overlooked without them. We need to make sure that nations honor UN Resolution 1325. It may only be a start in the long process of changing patriarchal structures, but all processes, I think, have to start somewhere. I hope you've learned a little more about the importance of women in peace building around the world. I know I have over the past couple of days. From snowy Alamosa, Colorado, I'm Samuel Garcia. Thanks for watching.